Hello everyone, this is Professor Reha here with the class examination of the Sentinel. This is, again, intended for improving, or the assumption that you're a new player and maybe you don't have the items you need, and we'll cover item builds later on in other videos in an entirely different set list. And for experimentation. Now, the Sentinel is interesting. I enjoy playing the Sentinel, not necessarily from an improv point of view or anything like that. I just think it's a lot of fun to play in general. I understand that it's not really for everyone because it tends to be a fairly defensive, retaliation-focused combination. So, since they mildly nerfed retaliation in the most recent Nature update, this particular class hasn't really been that popular. Which is understandable, but if you're just playing for fun, then that doesn't really matter. And if you're not building a character to farm for you, since you should really only technically have 2, maybe 3 actual farming characters, then it doesn't really make a difference. But for this combination, there are 2 very broad playstyles you can run this with, and that mostly falls on which Oathkeeper ending item you really want to go with, broadly speaking. There is, of course, a possession version, and I'll talk about that in a hot minute, but a lot of people tend to break this down by, oh, am I going to be using Divine Mandate, or am I going into Path of the 3? Now, commonly, a lot of people go with Path of the 3. You've got the Acid Vitality, the poison damage. You're converting your physical and fire damage to acid. Let's talk about it, because it's a fairly interesting and surprisingly more complex than you would think topic. Now, what's interesting about Path of the 3 is that it's not converting all of your physical and fire damage into acid damage. In fact, you're only ever going to be converting 15% of your physical damage. Your fire damage goes up, I think it goes up to about 35, no, it's 40, pardon me, 40%, I thought it was 35, I couldn't quite remember. I don't usually run a Path of the 3 version of this. It's just a personal preference of mine. It is an extreme... It's fairly effective. It's just not how I personally prefer to play it. But it still comes back to the point of, oh wow, I'm not converting all of my physical and fire damage, so what do I do? Because there is some hesitation here. Alright, so now I'm doing 4 kinds of damage, and the physical damage is very slight and not being boosted. The fire damage is medium-ish and not being boosted. How do I run this? Well, you've got a couple of different ways you can run this. There's a few different options. Now, first off, when you're running Path of the 3, you can run pretty much any skill here as much as you want, but I do really recommend you at least consider Guardian of Empyrean with Scion of Dreeg, because that actually causes them to reduce enemies' poison, acid, and vitality resistances, which is fairly potent. Also keep a note on the bleeding resistance. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later on, but just remember that bleeding resistance is reduced here. So I do recommend at least considering that, but as for everything else, you can basically go with whatever. This is physical damage that gets converted, internal trauma doesn't. Not really a huge problem. It's another damage type that you can do. I mean, you can run anything in particular. You could go with the alterations that change fire damage more completely into acid damage. And here you have physical being converted to acid and fire being converted to vitality. Now keep in mind that not all of this fire damage is going to be vitality damage. You're going to have some of that converted to acid damage, but that's, relatively irrelevant. At least if I understand the chain of abilities correctly. Since this technically is active all the time, this takes a little bit more priority over Righteous Fervor, which is not active all the time. So, because this will, essentially how this works is, Path of the 3 is active all the time, so right as soon as you activate this, 15% of your fire damage is being converted to acid damage. So then, when you start hitting people with Righteous Fervor, that's when this triggers, and then the remaining fire damage that it's doing is then being converted to vitality damage. Essentially, if I'm understanding how that works. It's the only thing I'm unsure of, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. But yeah, you can basically run anything you really want to here, and you're going to... What you're basically doing here, if you run Path of the 3 with any of these particular skills that do fire damage, you're essentially splitting up your damage out into 4 different versions, which is immediately apparent from the ultimate. You've got your physical damage, not a whole lot, not well boosted. You've got your fire damage, more than the physical. You're doing less fire damage than the physical damage because more of your fire damage is being converted, but you're still doing a little bit. And then finally, you're doing your vitality and poison acid. Now, what skills you pull from the Oathkeeper side of this class is really going to depend on what you want to pull out of the Occultist side, because from the Occultist side with Oathkeeper, again, with Path of the Three, there's a whole lot you can do here. First off, what's fairly interesting is that this is one of the few times in which you can actually bring in a single one of the pets and actually play really well. Even Familiar with Path of the Three. Now, the Familiar is a little bit better with Divine Mandate for the obvious reason that there's a dedicated boost of fire damage, and you can splash some lightning damage with Soulfire up here. But you could splash the Familiar in here even with Path of the Three and have an okay time of it. I don't recommend it, there are better options, but you could do that. If you find an item that boosts Summon Familiar or any of the skills afterwards, that would be fine. This is actually one of the few combinations where I really do appreciate the Hellhound, because, oh look, you're boosting your fire damage, you're boosting some chaos damage, you can go with a really nifty Righteous Fervor build with Slael's Witchfire, grab Consecrated Blade to provide yourself with extra chaos damage if you really want to. You can do the Vitality Chaos damage combination here. This is boosting your chaos damage and your fire damage. You're doing fire damage here. You can go with a really heavy focus on the auto attacks, and that's potentially very interesting, especially if you decide to splash in Smite and Shattering Smash. If you choose to use a shield, you could also run Safeguard as well, and you can just really basically run this very impressive auto attack focused build. You can do that with the Hellhound, absolutely. You could do instead a boosted Sigil of Consumption, which is fairly interesting because the fire damage out of this will be converted, and then from there you can kind of fill in the gaps as much as you need. Now, if I'm going to run Sigil of Consumption with Destruction, I'm still probably going to use Righteous Fervor, because Righteous Fervor is very good against single targets, and then the Sigil of Consumption is good against basically everything, and then I'll want something against groups, which will generally, I generally will use Aegis of Men here, but sometimes I'll bust out Judgment or Virus Might, depending on what abilities I have. I don't usually go into Eye of Reckoning because that lightning damage isn't converted, so with Path of the Three, although it can work, again, you can pull the Crow in for this if you really want to. I don't usually go at least up to Soulfire. Sometimes I'll just use Eye of Reckoning and leave Soulfire alone, but I'm usually not going to bother with either of them. At least with Path of the Three. But you can absolutely do this. You can splash in Doombolt if you want. But this is a really great move here as well if you decide to go with the Hellhound. If you decide not to go with the Hellhound, you have a whole bunch of options. Obviously, Dreeg's Evil Eye and all of its accents are great, but one of my absolute favorite things to do with Path of the Three, especially if I have the Guardians of Empyrean with Scion of Dreeg, is Bloody Pox. Consider, you've got the Vitality and the Bleeding damage, you've got percentage reduction, more Vitality and Bleeding. What's that? Poison damage, more Vitality, more Bleeding. Oh, wow. Yeah, it really actually does a lot of damage with Celestial Presence from your Scions of Dreeg, and that becomes quite the impressive amount of damage. So when I run Path of the Three, I am usually going to run Bloody Pox, because it is, especially, again, in conjunction with the Guardians of Empyrean, that is an absolutely devastating combination. And then at that point, what else I build is going to change depending on my mood, what items I have. I typically will pick up Blood of Dreeg because it does provide that heal. Again, I'll usually pick up Aspect of the Guardian for the damage buff, and then from there, it's pretty much whatever I feel like building. It depends on my items and what have you. I usually won't go all the way up here, obviously, though. I usually go to here. Maybe I'll grab Doombolt, splash in some chaos damage there. Maybe I'm just going to go into Slael's Witchfire and Righteous Fervor. Maybe I don't. Maybe I just go with Aegis of Men here. It really depends upon what I have. and how dedicated I am to the improv setup and what I feel like at the time. But these are all great skills for Path of the Three, but in terms of the Occultist abilities, you really can't go wrong. In terms of the Oathkeeper abilities, you really can't go wrong, although keep in mind that the more Oathkeeper abilities you bring into the Path of the Three build, the more dispersed your damage is going to be. Now, you often hear me talk about not focusing in on one specific damage type, which is very important. Usually I advocate for doing 1 to 3. 4 is a little bit more than what I'm usually comfortable dispersing my damage out to, because that is a absolutely massive spread. There are a lot of skills, such as Possession. Possession increases, broadly speaking, 3 damage types. It says 4 here, but Poison, Acid, as you've probably noticed, are basically the same damage type. Acid is, Acid is the one-shot deal, and Poison is just the damage over time version of Acid. Same thing with Vitality Decay. Vitality Decay is the damage over time version of Vitality. So basically it's 3. Acid, Vitality, Chaos damage. Poison, Vitality, Decay are just the dots. But it's basically only 3 damage types. That's generally what I try to keep my damage output for. And this is primarily my issue with Path of the Three and why I don't often run Path of the Three builds. It's dispersing my damage too much a lot of the time. If I'm going to run a Path of the Three build, most of my skills are going to come out of Occultist. And although it is a lot of fun doing an auto-attack build using Smite, Shattering Smash, Righteous Fervor, and Soil's Witchfire, whether or not you include the Hellhound, do keep in mind that you're doing such a diversity of damage. While no enemy is going to completely resist you, you're also going to find that there's going to be a lot of cases where you're only doing about 3/4 of your damage because you are doing 4 completely different damage types. You're doing an element, you're doing Poison, Acid, you're doing Vitality, and you're doing Physical. The enemy will either resist the Physical, decently common, the Fire, also decently common, the Vitality, basically anything that says Chthonic, or the Poison, Acid, which is going to be about half of beasts. The Slith, for instance, are fairly resistant to the Poison Acid, so it is going to be this very interesting scenario where some portion of your damage is going to be resisted. Now, enemies that resist the Poison or the Vitality are going to be much more resistant because that is actually what Path of the Three is increasing and converting to, particularly the Acid. But enemies that resist your Physical are still going to be a bit of a problem, because typically enemies that resist Physical are also resistant to something else. It's just a matter of what that something else is. Again, usually bosses, heroes, and nemesis are pretty resistant to physical damage, at least to some small extent. It's just inherent with them. So, I do advise caution with Path of the Three, although there's no wrong way to build it. If you're not careful, you will disperse your damage too much. It's very easy to save a build that's got its damage dispersed. You just have to go to the some skill readjuster and just pull some points out of one skill and put them into another. And it's really interesting to improv a Path of the Three build because it's very pot-lucky. I mean, you're either going to get really lucky with your items and absolutely dominate, and you get items that are going to boost just the right skills for you. I mean, let me rephrase that, just the right combination of skills, or you're going to get items that are all going to focus on just this disparate group of skills that are going to disperse your damage out in ways you really don't want. Now, to tackle the other main type, there's more than just these two, but this is how a lot of people talk about it, is Divine Mandate. Now, if you're running Divine Mandate, almost all of your abilities are going to be Oathkeeper. It's just the fact of the Sentinel with Divine Mandate. A Divine Mandate Sentinel is mostly pulling its skills from the Oathkeeper. You might splash in the Familiar. You could feasibly splash in the Sigil of Consumption if you really want to at least have some Vitality and Chaos damage, but you're already going to be doing physical and fire damage, which isn't too bad in most cases. Sure, every once in a blue moon there'll be a hero or a boss or a nemesis that'll be resistant to both, and that'll be a problem, but generally speaking, it's not really so much of a problem here, and the Crow is basically just going to be there to heal you, because Oathkeeper itself does not have any natural healing, and you can increase that healing from the Crow with Resilience, which does help because the Crow isn't exactly hyper-consistent with that, but if you're going to run a Divine Mandate Oathkeeper, basically your options are the Familiar, and maybe you go into Curse of Frailty, Vulnerability, perhaps you pick up Bloody Pox for reduction of health. Sometimes I'll do that with even Divine Mandate, mostly, again, for that reduction of health. It's so incredibly potent. Not always. It really depends, again, on my items. It depends on if I feel like going into Curse of Frailty or Vulnerability. But, yeah, you're generally going to be going into Divine. If you're going into Divine Mandate, most of your skills are going to come out of the Oathkeeper. Now, then we come across my personal preferred way of running this particular class. Possession Sentinel. This opens up a lot of very specific opportunities. Now, if you're playing a Possession Sentinel, you're, again, able to pull any non-pet skill out of the Occultist part of this and make it work really well. That is pretty obvious. That doesn't really need to be said. You've seen enough of these videos probably to know that Possession plus anything non-pet from the Occultist is good times a-rollin'. But it also offers a very unique opportunity with the Oathkeeper, very specifically, extremely specific skills. When I run a Possession Sentinel, I'm really fond of running Aegis of Menhir with Aegis of Thorns, and Righteous Fervor with Dreeg's Reproach. And this gets very interesting. It also gets very interesting. Again, you can still do the Scion of Dreeg. It's very expensive skill point-wise, but you can do it. It's still very effectively. But if I'm going to play a Possession Sentinel, I'm only looking at possibly these three. Everything else is dead to me. I don't care. Except possibly Resilience if I'm going with... I almost forgot about this. I will sometimes build Resilience if I feel like I just want the extra healing, or if I have some points to burn at the end of my build. You know, maybe you've got 3 or 4 points that you don't know where else to put, and there's no skills that pop out at you and say, hey, put them in me. Yeah, put them in Resilience. It doesn't hurt, especially if you have Blood of Dreeg. If you have Blood of Dreeg or Sigil of Consumption, Resilience is worth considering. If you don't have either of those, don't bother. But Resilience is another potential one. I don't usually go with Presence of Virtue even. It really depends on how much energy I need. I have built this a couple of times in the early part of a build because I need the energy regeneration, and early on in a build you don't necessarily have the items or the components attached to your items to increase your energy the way you want it to be. For me, very often, it's just a matter of early build, I'm spamming items, I'm spamming skills, excuse me, not spamming items. I'm spamming skills, and the items that I'm equipped with just don't provide me with the energy regeneration I need. So I'll sometimes, in the short term, build Presence of Virtue and then pull the points out of that later on, when I no longer need that energy regen from this particular skill. And then I'll just do whatever here as well. But that's actually a really interesting time as well. Now, if I am going to be running a Possession... a Possession Occultist, I usually do build Blood of Dreeg, and that's because you can actually build a very impressive Retaliation build, which, again, Retaliation has been mildly nerfed, but this is, if you want to do a really interesting Retaliation build, this is the most aggressive Retaliation build you can run. Aegis of Menhir, Avenging Shield, Aegis of Thorns, Reprisal, Righteous Fervor, good old Dreeg's Reproach. I was going to call it Blood of Dreeg, but I knew that was wrong. And then you go into Summon Guardian of Empyrean, this here. And that's just as much resistance as you can get, and that's, you know, fine or whatever. Or maybe you just want to put the points into other things. Maybe you don't want to necessarily go into the Guardian of Empyrean. Maybe you want to pull these points out and go instead into a nice, delicious... I don't know, let's spice it up a little bit. Maybe we want... yeah, actually, let's go with Dreeg's Evil Eye, what the heck. Maybe you want to go into this. And have yourself a magical time. Right? No. And you can absolutely do this. I mean, there's a couple of different options, but this is a really interesting and quite enjoyable Retaliation build because it does permit you to be very aggressive, since you can utilize that Retaliation damage into, and pull that into the Aegis of Menhir, which then allows you to bust out large quantities of extra damage through this, and also through just the Aegis of Thorns. 38% of your Retaliation damage is going into this, and then you have Retaliation damage added to attack here as well. Now, Retribution here is technically optional. You don't necessarily need to go into this if you don't want to, even with the Retaliation build. I miss the good old days. Back before the last major update, which I believe was 1.1.8, 1.1.7, 1.1.9, I can't remember. But way back in the day, Dreeg's Evil Eye also benefited a bit from retaliation damage. I think it was 5 or 10%, I can't quite remember. If you remember down in the comment section below, please let me know. I can't quite remember what that percentage is off the top of my head. It wasn't a big percentage, but it was there. It used to be on, I believe, the Vile Eruption, but they took it off because it was too powerful, which is a shame because then they nerfed retaliation damage in the next major update. In another update. I think they pulled that off 2 updates ago. 2 major updates ago. I can't remember. But it used to have retaliation damage attached to it. It was either at the Vile Eruption or the Terrifying Gaze point. I can't remember which. I think it was Vile Eruption. But yeah, don't be afraid of going into a Possession Sentinel. Not a lot of people talk about it. I don't know how many people run a Possession Sentinel off the top of my head. I'm not really sure. This is not a build that's commonly talked about because it's, quote, obvious. Technically speaking, it is, but it is a lot of fun to experiment with. There's a lot of things you can do with this combination that don't necessarily occur to a lot of people, or if it does, they don't talk about it much. At least not that I've seen. I must confess I'm not quite as active on the subreddit or the forum as I'd like to be. Actually, I haven't been on the forum in a hot minute. But I really need to get back on there, actually. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with this. Don't be afraid to experiment. Like I said, it's even if you make a mistake in the build, which it is possible, as well coordinated as this combination can be, it is possible to make mistakes, but this, out of all of the other classes, this one's pretty easy to fix the mistakes on. So don't be afraid to experiment, because if you goof it, it's very easy to fix. Your equipment is going to be harder to change than your skills here. Well, let me rephrase that. It's harder to make your equipment work than it is to make the skills work together here. The skills are not going to be your problem. You just have to make sure that you either already own or are getting the correct items. So, not a whole lot to talk about with this one because it's just so very coordinatable. I've shown you some of my favorite ways of playing some of these, and I hope it helped. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. I love to read them. And if you, yeah, that's about it. Thank you very much for joining me. Have a great 24 hours.